And so this is your last day officially with the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police, because you've retired, but you've been coming in one day a week to kind of keep us all in line.
Well, I thought I could help out, and Kenny asked me to help out, and I was glad to do that.
So you've had a long career, which I'm just amazed by. 46 years with journalism, working in education, working in law enforcement. How long did you work in journalism?
About 25 years in journalism. I started in Monmouth, and I worked in Monmouth and Galesburg for a while, and then came to Springfield and spent a lot of time here in Springfield.
What places did you work here in Springfield?
I worked at the Catholic newspaper, the Catholic Times, and then I also worked at Illinois Issues magazine for 10 years.
What did you do at the Illinois Issues magazine?
At Illinois Issues, I was the publisher. I was the first full-time publisher that they hired because they recognized that the business side of it needed a lot of attention, and so they brought me on. And the publisher is different from an editor. A lot of people don't know the difference. The publisher oversees policy and handles the business side of it and kind of the institutional side of it, and the editor manages all the editorial content in the magazine. And I was the publisher, and that gave me the opportunity at the university to also do some special research projects too. Research into campaign finance reform in Illinois, which we did with Paul Simon, and then also we did the first statewide survey of civic engagement in Illinois to figure out how Illinoisans are active in their communities and why.
What was the result of that with the engagement survey?
The engagement survey showed, here's something that I always remember. The biggest difference, if you're trying to get people involved in something, and everybody's always saying, how are we going to get more people involved? The single biggest difference between people who are engaged and not engaged is that people who were engaged in one way or another were asked to do so personally by somebody. They didn't respond to some general solicitation. They just didn't show up, although some do. But someone asked them. So if you really do want someone to help out and support your cause, you're going to have to personally ask them to do that. That's one of the big findings. And another big finding was that people approach their philanthropy or they approach their civic engagement usually for some specific reason or for different reasons. For example, some people become involved in a charitable group because of their faith, and we call them faith-based engagement people. Some people do it because they actually want to get something for themselves. I mean, they're looking for a quid pro quo, and there's nothing wrong with that, but they really do hope to either make connections or benefit personally, and so they get involved in something. And so we discovered that there are some very different and specific reasons that people get involved.
What other research projects did you handle while you were there?
We did a major research project on campaign finance reform in Illinois. This was in the mid-1990s, and Professor Kent Redfield, who is still known as Illinois' expert on campaign finance, we worked with him and a woman named Barbara Ferrara in the Institute for Public Affairs, and we did a lot of research into how campaigns were financed around the region, and Paul Simon and Governor Stratton were the two co-chairs of that project for us, and we ended up making 19 recommendations for changing Illinois' campaign finance laws, and over time most of those were actually enacted.
How many do you think weren't enacted?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
Just a couple, you think?
Most of them were. It's about all I really remember.
That's pretty amazing that most of it was enacted. I think that's very impressive.
It was really helpful. Just there were a lot of practical things that needed to be changed in the way things were handled. For example, it used to be that if you wanted to see somebody's campaign report, you had to fill out a form and identify yourself and say, not only here's the report that I want to see, but here's why I want to see it. And so actually Kent Redfield became the leading filer of these reports, because he would just ask for everybody's report all the time with the State Board of Elections. And there was two big problems with that. It was burdensome for the State Board of Elections, and back then everything was paper. And so they had to produce all these paper reports. And then second, these were public records, and there was no reason that you should have to identify yourself in order to see a public record. Yeah. And so we did get that changed.
That's great. What drew you to campaign finance reform?
It was because I was at UIS and Kent Redfield was there, and we got some funding from the Joyce Foundation, and there was a vice president at the Joyce Foundation who really wanted Illinois to move to public financing of political campaigns, and he says we need the data. He says right now everybody knows there's problems, but we don't have the data. And we'll fund the research if you want to do this. And so his name was Larry Hansen, just one of the brightest people I've ever met. And one of the outcomes of our campaign finance project was the establishment of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform, which is still in existence today by a different name. A lot of people will recognize the name of Cindy Canary. Well, Cindy was on our advisory board when we were doing our campaign finance research, and then she's the one who headed up the ICPR when it got launched. And the reason that was important is our research just didn't die. She was able to pick it up and actually do something with it then and help get these changes enacted.
That's great. And I guess you're going back to what you were saying, is you have to be asked.
You have to be asked.
That's kind of how you make some change and get people engaged. So that's really great. Anything else that you handled research-wise at the university?
Those were the two main ones. Of course, at Illinois Issues Magazine, that Paul Simon was one of the founders of that. I don't think a lot of people know that Paul taught at Sangamon State University in the mid-1970s, and it was really his idea, along with a couple of other people, to launch a statewide public affairs magazine, and that's what we did. And not we, because I wasn't there at the time, but then they brought me on. And one other research project that I did, I guess, was I worked with former Senate President Phil Rock on his political memoir. And that ended up being a book called Nobody Calls Just to Say Hello. And I approached Phil after he got out of the Senate and said, a lot of people really respect what you did as a leader, and you really ought to write about that. And at first he said no, but then he said, my grandkids are going to wonder what the heck I was doing in Springfield all those years. So one thing led to another, and that was a great research project that became a book about his influence on Illinois politics and government.
Well, that gets me to some of my other questions, because you are quite the author. How many books do you have to your name now?
I have 3, and I've contributed chapters to 4 other books.
Wow. What obviously you did a lot of writing for your other gigs and your other careers and things like that. So what are the names of the books that you've written, and tell me a little bit about them?
Well, the first one was called A Crisis of Hope in the Modern World, and that came out in 1991. And I was pretty cynical at the time about everything that I was observing, and I started off just kind of as a kind of a curmudgeon, wanting to document all the cynicism that I found, and it's pretty easy to find. But I was trying to put together why are people so cynical, and then over the course of that, I said I really don't want to write about cynicism, because the flip side of that is to be a person of hope, and so I wrote that book, and it came out in 91, and then I say I write a book every 25 years, and so the next one was with Phil Rock, and it came out in 2012. And there's one that's going to come out any day now. It's called Breach Point, and I wrote that with the police chief, retired Chief Kent Williams, who's retired from Bartlett, Illinois, and he's now on the national speaking circuit, talking about officer wellness is how they can find and achieve balance in their lives. And his presentation is absolutely stunning, and his message is absolutely stunning. And I approached him and I said, you should have a book, and kind of the same process. He says, well, yeah, what would it look like, and so forth. And so I don't think he would mind if I, said I kind of wrote it on, but it's by Kent Williams with Ed Wojcicki, and but I like doing that sort of thing, taking massive amount of information and putting it together into a book. So that one's it should be out early next year.
That's great. And again, it comes down to you have to be asked.
Yes.
That seems to be the theme. And of course, you already were pretty good with the whole cutting things down and putting things together as a journalist. What drew you to journalism, and then what drew you to leave?
Oh boy, those are two great questions. What drew me to it? I was in high school when Nixon was president, and I think a lot of people in our generation were inspired by the journalist who cracked that case, the Watergate case, and then Nixon ended up resigning as a result. And then there was a book called Boys on the Bus that came out, and a movie by the same title. And I think that we believe journalists could kind of change the world if they did their thing. I believe that a little less now than I did when I first got into it. But that's what drew me to it, is I wanted to make an impact on the world by writing about what's going on. And I was a words guy, and I always showed up as a reporter, as a print journalist, and the TV people always irritated me because they would come in and plop their cameras down in front of everybody, and then they wouldn't stay for the whole thing. They would get their soundbite and leave, and we had to actually stay and do all the reporting. But that's just like inside baseball kind of stuff. But it's very exciting to have a front row seat on what's going on in your communities. And you're kind of like you're there on some of the best days of people's lives and some of the worst days of people's lives, and you try to document all that for a community. And one of the things that I really came to appreciate more and more over time was local journalism, because people need their local journalism, whether it's radio, TV, or print, in order to really know what's going on in their communities. People rely on that more than they know, and we're seeing, of course, now the great decline of print journalism, and that's for business reasons. It's nobody's been able to figure out the new model, but words and news are still really important.
And so, what made you decide to leave journalism? I guess you never really leave it, but...
Well, I did. Here's what happened. I was at UIS, and I was at Illinois Issues was published by UIS, and so I was an employee of UIS, and we got a new chancellor, Rich Ringeisen, who I really liked. I had been there for about 10 years, and he came from North Carolina, and the state of North Carolina, actually from East Carolina University, and I got to know him just a little bit, and after a while I said to him, I says, you know what, you've never worked in a state where labor unions are really active, and you don't understand Illinois government, and in order to be successful here in the capital city, you're going to need to understand both, and I can help you with that. And we talked about it a couple times, and he brought me on to help him. And that's when I left journalism. It was to begin my career in higher ed administration.
That's great. Quick question: have you ever decided to write an autobiography on yourself?
An autobiography. I think to write an autobiography, you really have to have a market, and I think the market would be fewer than 5 people, and so no, I have no interest in writing an autobiography.
I think plenty of people would be interested in your thoughts on a lot of different things, because you have had such a storied career with journalism, working in education, working with law enforcement. I mean, there's a lot of similarities, I would presume, between journalism, education, at least there are some, and then working into law enforcement was just a big transition, I would assume. How did you get involved with joining the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police?
I got to the Illinois Chiefs, actually it was my wife who saw the ad. There's 5 generations of law enforcement on her side of the family, and she knew that I was getting to be an age and a time in my career where I might be wanting to do something else and leave higher ed administration. And she said, you might want to do this, look into this work at the Police Chiefs Association. There's so many police in her family, therefore in my family, and so there's a great passion for law enforcement there. And I really thought that I could help because with my communications background and my ability to listen and to listen to a lot of people complain and then to respond well and appropriately in order to make a difference. One of the things I told when I interviewed for this job, I didn't know I was going to get it or not, but I said, you need a lot of friends, and I can help you find some friends. And that was kind of my attitude coming into this job. And then the other thing about this job was we do a lot with lobbying and legislative advocacy. And when I worked at UIS, I was on the U of I's government relations team, and so I was very active. In between working at Illinois Issues and then working on the lobbying team for the U of I had a lot of familiarity with what's going on in the Capitol here, and I don't take that for granted. I think when you're in Springfield, sometimes you do, but then people come to Springfield and you realize they really don't know what's going on. And so at any rate, I thought I could help the law enforcement and help the chiefs in their messaging at the Capitol, and also use a lot of chiefs need a lot of training, officers need a lot of training, further education, and with my education background, I was able to bring some of that to the association too, and to find ways to help our members get the training and education they need.
And so you were mentioning about they needed lots of friends. So how did you incorporate that and going about getting the friends, I guess? Well,
I show up. I mean, that's I have never found a substitute for just showing up in places. And so I knew some people who worked on the legislative staffs. I knew some legislators. I knew some of the leaders. And so I would reach out to them and say, here's what we're thinking about. A lot of it is, it's important to have those conversations when you don't really want something, when you're just building the relationship. And also I reached out to the, some organizations that I thought that we ought to be working with, like the Illinois Sheriff's Association, the FOP, the unions, and the unions, sometimes we would joke and say, well, you're labor, we're management, but there's a lot of things about law enforcement that we can agree on. And so we did try to work together to the extent that we can. And then a big one too was, I started this job 2 or 3 months after Michael Brown died in Ferguson. And so the country was erupting with anti-police sentiment. And so a couple of us, a couple of our chiefs and myself, we reached out to the NAACP statewide, and we started having conversations. And we said, you know what? We don't want the kinds of riots that we're seeing all around the country and that sort of thing. We think we can do better if we start talking to one another very candidly. And so we did. And in the first meeting we had with the at the time, the president of the NAACP was in Evanston, a man by the name of George Mitchell, and it was just 3 or 4 of us in the room, and his opening statement was, you got to stop killing our black boys. And, we just said, okay, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that sentiment. Now let's talk about that. What does that mean? What's your perception? Here's what we think. Here's, what can we do differently? How can we do better? And so on. And so rather than get upset or offended by criticism, we embraced it and we went right through the wall together with our friends at the NAACP, and now we have a really robust relationship. And it's kind of interesting that some of our members get or some of our leaders get criticized by our members for engaging with the NAACP, and some of the NAACP leaders get criticized by their members for engaging with the police, because some people say just back into your corner and scream, and fortunately we have a lot of level-headed people, and we are friends, and we think we're building trust one conversation at a time, and in the long run it's really going to pay off.
That brings me to some of the things when you were working with the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police. What were some of the things that you were most proud of?
I can say I'm most proud of, but all this was done in collaboration with a lot of people. And I think that I am really proud of the fact that we moved the needle on police culture in Illinois. In the post-Ferguson era, it was very much of an us versus them mentality with a lot of people. And I'm not talking about only the black community or the brown community. I'm talking about there was a lot of people everywhere in Illinois who were saying, well, the police are just a bunch of racists. The police are just, all they do is beat up people and shoot people and that sort of thing. And they would make those kinds of generalized statements all the time. And honestly, for us to move forward, we had to listen to that. And we also had to acknowledge that there are historically some terrible stories about the treatment of minority communities by law enforcement. I mean, just awful stories. And we kind of know that. And so we acknowledged that. And in fact, our black friends asked us to acknowledge that. And we said, you're right. We do need to acknowledge that. It doesn't mean that. Now, some people got upset with us for doing that because they says, well, you're not back in the blue, and you're throwing everybody into the same basket of racist cops and so forth. And we said, no, we're not doing that. We can acknowledge the ugly parts of our history, and at the same time saying, well, that's not what we do now, and we're going to continue to try to do better. And so it's complicated, and some of it was difficult, but difficult is okay.
When we've talked previously, you've talked about how you're very proud of the 10 shared principles. Will you share some more on that?
Sure. You asked me the other question, and I talked about moving the needle on police culture, and let me just talk about that for just a second because I didn't really get to my point.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
My point is we moved. In order to move the needle, you have to move from this to that, right? And we were at that us versus them point, and we had to move past that. We had to. And so we have moved the needle on that. How far? I don't know. History doesn't know yet how far we move the needle. But now I think that we have helped create a culture in Illinois where law enforcement, A, is willing to acknowledge problems of the past, and B, is willing to get out there and do the kinds of community policing, do the the kinds of caretaking that are necessary to keep our people and our communities safe. And so it's a lot to ask of our police officers to sort of partially carry this burden, but they do. And at the same time, they say we really are here to serve, and we're gonna continue to serve our community. So that's what I meant by moving the needle. Now, on the 10 shared principles, that's a very long story, but it's an important story, and we did start with that first meeting with the NAACP president in Evanston, and then shortly after that, the presidency of their organization changed to Teresa Haley here in Springfield, which actually made it a little easier for us. And then her colleague Bob Moore, who's the chair of their criminal justice committee, Bob and Teresa became the primary two that we worked with. And it was at some point, and I believe I was the first one to say, you know what, we need to write down what we mean by positive police community relationship. You know what, there has to be some principles that we agree on. So let's try to identify what those principles are. You know, and when you look at them, they might sound like Captain Obvious kinds of statements, you know, but one of them is everybody should be treated with dignity and respect. And the reason that that's important is when we've gone around the state doing training sessions on these 10 shared principles, and Bob Moore will just say, have you ever not been treated with dignity and respect? And hands go up, you know, and so then people talk about that, and then we can say, well, you know, we're sorry about your story, but this is, you know, here's how we're trying to create a different kind of culture so that we can move forward in the future. So we almost only had 9 principles, and then Bob says, you know what, we really need to have 10 to round it off, and so that's fine. But it took like 9 or 10 drafts of this. We met in restaurants here in Springfield. We did a lot of stuff. This was pre-pandemic, and so we did a lot of stuff over the phone and in small gatherings, and we really hammered out what we meant by these being shared principles. You know, and one of them has to do with de-escalation. And one of the reasons it's important from a law enforcement perspective for obvious reasons. Let's de-escalate rather than, you know, try to ramp things up and increase the possibility of somebody getting hurt. But when I've been at meetings, public meetings with Teresa, she would say, you know what, that means us too. You don't be out there abusing and disrespecting the police when you're just doing your everyday interactions. You have to treat them with the same dignity and respect that you expect to be treated with. And so we do mean these as shared principles. And I think sometimes people focus on the word principles, but Bob and Teresa and I like to focus on the word shared because we really do share them. And you know, I'm talking as if I should get all the credit for this, but this started with President Fred Hayes back whenever that was in 2015, and we change presidents every year, and every single president that we've had made this a priority to keep advancing these shared principles. And just one other people like stories. You know, one of the things that I think is significant being in Springfield, we asked if we could have the signing of the shared principles in the old state capitol in the same room where Abraham Lincoln gave his House Divided speech, and we chose that room for an obvious reason. And of course they said yes, and you know, that's one of the advantages of being in Springfield is we have access to that. And it was a huge moment of pride for both of our organizations to be in that room and to sign these things and then to promulgate them. But it's not, and people might say, well, what difference does it make? You know, have they had any impact? Well, more than 300 police agencies have now individually and separately adopted these principles as their own. And so they're talking about them at the local level, at the community level, trying to build relationships and build trust there. Also, the Illinois Municipal League has adopted them, signaling to all the 1,298 municipalities throughout the state that, hey, we think this is something important for your police departments and the people in your communities. They become a source of conversation and a way for people to talk candidly, usually about bad experiences they've had with the police, but then also to say, let's move forward with this. One of my favorite stories about all of this comes when we did our first university sharing of the shared principles. We met with about 50 students out at UIS here, and they have a number of students from the inner city of Chicago. And what we do at these workshops is we sit citizens around the table with police officers, and they talk. That's what they do. They share stories and they share ideas around the table. And two students stood up at UIS when we were finished, and we kind of invite people to say stuff. And two students stood up and said, you know what, where I grew up, all I ever learned was F the police. And this is the first day I've ever had a chance to have a conversation with one, and it's really pretty good. And so that's what we mean by building trust, one conversation at a time.
I love that. How do you get the message out to the different police departments across the state to get them to want to join the 10 shared principles? Is it up to them to come to us, or do we have to ask?
Well, we do regular communication with our members in our command magazine and what we call our weekly bulletins and in other ways. And I feel like we've kind of inundated them with information about these 10 shared principles. And then also more than one of our presidents, notably President Jim Black went from Crystal Lake when he was the president, and now Lou Jogman, who's our current president. They've made it a goal of their presidency to get more agencies to endorse these shared principles. And so we make it very easy for them on our web. All they got to do is click a link on our website and click that, add their name to the list. They can do that in 1 minute. We hope the internal conversation is much longer back at the department, but we make it easy for them to do it. And then I have promoted it, and so have our presidents. And another thing is, at each of our annual conferences and at the expo, we have guest speakers from the NAACP and giving people an opportunity to just talk. That's usually what they do. They have conversations, but there's always some kind of presentation connected with that, and then always connected to that is an invitation to sign on to these shared principles.
Let's see, my next question is about what other achievements you've done since being with the ILACP that I'm going to say that you're proud of.
Okay. I actually... there are these achievements. Let's see. One I would say is the relationship that we have with our past two attorney generals, and especially our current one, Kwame Raoul, and the past one, Lisa Madigan. Both of them have been to our conferences. They've spoken. We've recognized both of them. But it was, pardon me, Kwame, for just calling you by your first name, but Kwame has the cell phone numbers of some of our leaders and regularly texts back and forth with them. He will ask them things, they will ask him things, and it was in 15, the year after Michael Brown died, Kwame was a state senator, and they were working on a police reform bill at the time. And as we were talking to them, his question to me was, he says, Ed, you know what? Can't we just get rid of the bad cops? And we said, we agree with you 100% on that, you know. But there are so many, there's some legal obstacles in place, there's some procedural obstacles in place. But part of the Safety Act that is not talked about much, probably because it makes sense, is that there's a whole new section in there about how bad cops can be decertified and how they have to be reported. Because like one of the problems in the profession has been if you're a bad cop here and you're bounced or you leave, you can go to the neighboring town and get a job there. And now it's more difficult to do that if you're gotten rid of for some really bad practice, or if you're under investigation for some really bad practice and you're gone. It's more difficult for them now to actually get hired at a different department, and that's bureaucratic, but it's really significant. And those are the kinds of things that I give a lot of credit to the Attorney General for, because it was his initiative to write more than 100 and some pages of that portion of the Safety Act, which we supported. We didn't. That's another story about the rest of the bill, but we really supported that section. And so I'm really proud of the fact that we were able to work behind the scenes. And we're talking about Jim Black, again, giving up a year of his life to get this done. He was very instrumental in that, along with our lobbyist, John Milner, and some of the other people on our legislative committee. All really worked so hard, because it's conceptually easy to say, let's get rid of bad cops, but then when you have to write down in legislation the exact language you need to do that, we were able to accomplish that, and I am really proud of that. That's a negative thing, because I don't mean to emphasize that there are bad cops, but it's important for the culture. I mentioned police culture before. It's important that we all stand united in wanting to get rid of those. There's one other one too that I cannot take credit for at all, but there's a problem now in the profession with too many suicides among law enforcement officers. It's just a fact, and it happens in Chicago several times a year, and it's heartbreaking. And it's the pressures of the job, it's the pressures of life, the pressures of family. It's a lot of pressures, but it's well known that a cop sees trauma every day, and sometimes multiple times in the same day. They finish up one call and then they go on another call, and not all of them is because there's a missing cat or a barking dog. They see some really bad things, and now it's becoming more accepted in the profession to say, you know what, let's just don't sweep that under the rug and say just deal with it and move on to the next call. Let's look at the trauma that you are experiencing. Let's name it. Let's talk about it. Let's get you some help if you need it, and on and on and on. And this is all under the category of officer wellness, and we have a very robust officer wellness committee, and there again, some of our leaders on our board have said they're going to make it a priority to raise awareness for officer wellness during their presidency, and that for the health of our officers and their families. It's not funny at all, but one of the things that cops will say when they're in our meetings and so forth, they'll say, well, we know that in our profession there's too many divorces, there's too much alcoholism, there's too much withdrawal, cops dead-assing it on the couch when they get home instead of really engaging with their families, and so on and so on. And so I think we, in the profession, we need to always be raising awareness that this is so, and because it's so, let's realistically address it so that they can live healthier lives.
So obviously that's going to answer part of my next question, which was, what do you see being the biggest hurdles for police officers, police departments over the next few years, things you want the association to hopefully work with them on and to accomplish?
Our members our chiefs and command staff, they say that right now recruitment is the biggest hurdle they have. It's the biggest challenge they have. And the reason that is officers, it wears them out listening to the criticism in the media, listening to so many people being given a voice for just declaring that all cops are racist, and that's kind of the standard line. And I think more and more of them are saying, "Who needs this?" It's too much. It's too much. And then along with that, I don't know if we're just noticing it more, but I think it's the reality that we're seeing more cops are getting ambushed and shot, or sometimes it's a fight, but they're ambushed and shot and hurt. And if you're the spouse of one of these officers, you're going to say, I think you might say, are you sure you want to stay in this profession? Because cops have always accepted that their lives are on the line every day, but the abuse that they get from people on the street is more than you can even imagine. The stories they tell, right now, it's common for if there's any kind of incident with police, people they're pulling out their cell phones and taking video of it, and it's their right to do that, and everybody recognizes it's their right to do that. But that kind of scrutiny is it wears on people, and so I think that one of the things that needs to happen is that public sentiment and the sentiment by politicians needs to change. Especially politicians don't think it's their fault. They always say it's not my fault. That police, the recruitment problem isn't my fault, and we just say. They say, some of them have said, well, what can we do to help? And we've said, well, you've already done it. You all of the public pronouncements we hear, all of the legislation and all the bad rhetoric that goes with it is detrimental to the profession. Now, we actually were for some of the changes in the law that, like, for example, I mentioned the decertification thing. We don't mind having body cameras mandated, especially now that there might be the funding for it. Before there was no funding. Now the state seems to have recognized that, and so we're all about accountability and training, but it's the scrutiny and the rhetoric that we think is really gone over the cliff, and the association can't bring that back. No single person can bring that back, but I want people to be aware that it's really a problem, and if you get on Facebook and start spouting off about the racist cops, you're part of the problem.
Very, very true and impactful statements there. And of course that goes hand in hand with the officer wellness that you were talking about, because that's, with all that scrutiny and negativity out there, it definitely impacts them quite a bit. I wanted to ask a quick question. So why didn't you yourself join law enforcement? Did you ever think about that? Because you said you had a lot of members in your wife's family and your family. Was that ever a consideration, or was just...
no one has ever asked me that before. It's, I was well into my career as a journalist, and then in higher ed administration, and then there's age restrictions. And first of all, I don't think I have the personal sort of mental framework to be a good police officer. It takes a certain skill set, and I really don't think I have that skill set. But also, it never really occurred to me. I always was going to do something else, like be a journalist or be a lawyer or something like that. So it just never really occurred to me.
Okay. What are some of the key things that you think should be included in the mental framework for someone who should be an officer?
If you want to be an officer, you have to care. I mean, you have to want to get rid of the bad guys, because there's a lot of bad guys. You have to, but at the same time, you recognize that your role is as a peace officer in addition to being a police officer, and that you really can be a positive spark in your own community and build bridges and make people feel safe where they didn't feel safe before, because you're trained to do that. So it's something else that I've never really been asked before, but that's what comes to mind.
The other question I have is, and of course I have to ask it, but how do you see social media integrated into current law enforcement policies, the pros, the cons, and what should be coming from that? I know that was a bunch of questions all at once, but we'll see what happens.
So social media, it's important for law enforcement to be engaged there, because that's where people are, and because that's where people are, law enforcement needs to be engaged there. Law enforcement would be well suited to be sort of promoting what they're doing when it comes to community engagement. They might also use social media, and I haven't seen too much of this on social media, to explain why they do what they do, because that's one of the things that causes problems on traffic stops or in pedestrian stops. Maybe people don't know what is expected of them, and they don't know why the officers are doing what they're doing. And that's one of our shared principles, is that we have a mutual obligation to be teaching why we do what we do. Why do cops approach a car in a certain way? And that's where a whole lot of people have their only interaction with the cop. It's when they get pulled over. And so social media could be used for that kind of system. Now, part of the problem with that is, how many people would watch it or how many people would read it. It's one thing to put stuff out there, but that doesn't mean anybody is paying any attention. And then the other way, though, that I think police can wisely use social media is just to monitor it in their own communities. And I'm not an expert on social media, but let's say Facebook, monitor the Facebook accounts of your community leaders, especially some of those who might be critical of the police, and it's an opportunity to engage civilly on that social media instead of people just running their mouths off and that sort of thing. And so you can be proactive in putting information out, and it's called social because it's supposed to be communication back and forth, and people can use it for that purpose. Now it's in this climate, the rhetoric is so over the top in so many cases that sometimes it's hard to actually engage, but I think people ought to try.
Who do you foresee being the perfect person to kind of do that and interact on social media for the department, like a chief or a PIO who should be keeping an eye on that? Or do you think maybe there needs to be a position within the department that does handle that?
I think that a lot of that just might grow organically. Certainly it needs to be a position in a department. Somebody needs to be assigned the task of doing that. But also, if you look at Trooper Tracy, she has hundreds of thousands of followers. I don't know what she's got, but she's got a huge following, and she's no longer a trooper. She's gotten a promotion in the state police, and she uses her platform very effectively. And I don't know if she just started doing that on her own or how it happened, but it kind of looks to me like she just started doing it on her own, and it's worked out very well. And so I guess at a minimum, somebody in a department should be assigned to be working on it and monitoring it, but it probably takes somebody with that kind of skill and passion to do it. Just somebody rise up and do it, no matter what your rank or where you are. Whether it should be the chief or not, I don't know. It's because I don't know if people in a community care so much whether it's the chief or an officer. To them, anybody with the uniform is going to represent the department, and so I think engaging would be a good idea.
I completely agree. And sometimes it is just takes somebody standing up and doing it and saying, hey, I see there's a hole here, let me plug that and see where it goes from there. That's personally how it worked with me at some of my previous jobs, where I saw nobody was doing it, and I'm like, well, why is nobody doing it? I'm just going to go ahead and do it, and we'll see what happens from there. And
that's how things often happen. Yeah.
You either have to step up and do it, or you have to be asked.
Right.
Those are the only two options sometimes. I know we're getting lengthy here, so I want to kind of...
It can be edited. I hope it's edited. Seriously.
I think these are great stories. It's stuff that people would want to know. It's stuff that I'm really enjoying getting to know you. I've only been here a few weeks, and that's been some of the highlights of me being here, is getting to know you and your philosophies and where you're from and what all you've done. And I'm probably going to be leaning on you a little bit. You'll get some text messages.
I'll be there for you. I'll be there for you.
I appreciate it, because I will ask.
Okay.
Well, I'll just wrap it up here just real quick. What is one of the most impactful stories, a story that shows something that had great impact on you or your life during your career? Something that stands out.
In my whole career?
In your whole career.
Holy cow.
Yeah. You can, narrow it down to a couple top ones if you want to. It's a big question. It's a big ask.
You know what? I'll take a recent one. Okay. But it's one that I learned from Mitch Davis, President Davis, Chief Davis, whose picture's on the wall right here. That's why I'm looking up. He wrote an article for our magazine, and he was our first black president, and for him that was very significant. And he talked a lot about why it was significant that he was our first black president. But at any rate, when he wrote this article a few years ago on leadership, he said in there that every black male by the age of 18 has had a negative experience with the police. And I almost edited that out of his article. But then I said to him, is that really true? He said, yes, it's true. It's true. He said, now I don't know if the same is true of every white male, every Hispanic male, whatever, but given the climate that we're in, that statement has stayed with me. And as we have been going around the state, doing our work with the 10 shared principles with adults, college students, high school students, whenever there's a significant black participation at our meetings, when it's my turn to speak, I always now say, hey, Chief Davis told me that every black male by the age of 18 has had a negative experience. And I am testing that out wherever I go because I don't want to believe that that's true. But I said, if it is true, then we as a profession have to address that. And so I would ask it at all the events that I would go to like that, when it was, worthy of any kind of group discussion. And among the blacks in the audience, everyone always agreed. And yeah, I'm pausing now because that's what I do. And I would always just say, Teresa would be with me and Bob would be with me. And I'd say, I sure don't want to believe that, but I really respect that that's your reality and that's your story. And my hope is that maybe 18 years from now, as we continue to build trust, one conversation at a time, somebody might ask this same question, and we'll begin to have people who say, no, that's not been my experience. And that's because of the work that we're doing together.